Professor Oded Lifshitz from the Department of Archaeology and Ancient Near Eastern Cultures at Tel Aviv University is inviting you to join him to a journey following those who composed the historical descriptions in the Hebrew Bible.
The Untold Story of the King of Judah, Part A. Introductory chapters. Chapter 5. Israel in the Hebrew Bible and the History of Israel. There are large gaps between the Israel described in the Hebrew Bible, the Israel that can be reconstructed by following the archaeological evidence, and the Israel that appears in written sources other than the biblical historiography. Comparing the Israel described in the Hebrew Bible to historical Israel is a good starting point for demonstrating the limitation of the biblical description as a historical source. Let's start. The name Israel appears in the Hebrew Bible 2,512 times. In 38 of these cases in the biblical description, but nowhere outside of it, the term is used as the other personal name of Jacob, who is Israel. According to Genesis 32, verses 27 and 28, this is the name given to him by God. And I'm quoting, "And he, God, said to him, 'What is your name?' And he said, 'Jacob.' Then he, God, said, 'Your name shall no more be called Jacob, but Israel. For you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed.'" End of quote. According to the story, the 12 sons of Jacob, Israel, the sons of Israel, immigrated to Egypt during a time when, according to Genesis 46, verses 26-27, the family totaled 70 members overall. I'm quoting, "All the persons belonging to Jacob who came into Egypt, who were his own offsprings, not including Jacob's sons' wives, were 66 persons in all. And the sons of Joseph, who were born to him in Egypt, were 2. All the persons of the house of Jacob then came to Egypt were 70. End of quote. This family is mentioned again in Exodus 1, verse 5, noting a number, the same number like in Genesis. And I'm quoting, "All the offsprings of Jacob were 70 persons. Joseph was already in Egypt." However, in Egypt, after 400 or 430 years, this family had become a great nation. And I can quote from Exodus 1, verse 7. "But the descendants of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them." The description characterizes Israel as a young nation, a family that became a nation at a relatively late period in the history of the ancient Near East, when all the other nations mentioned in the Hebrew Bible already existed and lived on their land. Only after God chose that particular family, he made them a nation in Egypt and then led the sons of Israel away from slavery by way of wandering in the Sinai desert for 40 years. It was only during this period that Yahweh revealed that he was the one true God of Israel and bound the Israelites to him in covenant bonds. After 40 years of wandering through the desert, following the death of Moses and under the leadership of Joshua, the tribes of Israel could conquer the promised land from the hand of the Canaanites, the ancient inhabitants of the land. The first part of the book of Joshua describes how the people or tribes who make up the sons of Israel crossed the Jordan, and in a series of quick battles and military operations under the leadership of Joshua, defeated the kings of the large Canaanite cities, conquered large part of the land, and decimated most of the native population, those ancient peoples and locals who had lived in Canaan from time immemorial up to that period when God gave the land to the Israelites. After the conquest of the land, the story in the book of Joshua continues to describe the process whereby the conquered Canaanite territory was divided up among each of the tribes of Israel, and the settlement of the tribes in the new land they had conquered. And I can read from Joshua 12, verse 7, and Joshua gave their land to the tribes of Israel as a possession according to their allotments. At this point in the history, Israel had turned from a nation of nomadic shepherds into a nation of farmers and villagers living on their own land. According to the book of Judges, the ancient tribal family structure continued to exist when each family and each tribe lived on their own land, and the unity of the people weakened. Furthermore, as long as Joshua and the elders who together with him led the generation of the desert continued to lead the people, and I can quote from Joshua 24:23, Israel served Yahweh all the days of Joshua and all the days of the elders who outlived Joshua, end quote. And the reason for it is that they, quote, had known all the work which Yahweh did for Israel. According to the book of Judges, after the death of Joshua and the elders who led the Israelites through the desert, the tribes of Israel repeatedly broke their covenant with God, began worshipping local Canaanite gods, and adopted their rituals. As a result, Yahweh punished them and allowed local nations and outside invaders to occupy part of the land for short periods and enslave various Israelite tribes that lived in those areas. Whenever the Israelites were in great distress, they understood that this was a punishment from the God, returned to worship him, and prayed to him for help. During these times, God had appointed the saviors, the biblical judges, who would act in his name, led the people to great victories, and rule over Israel during the long and peaceful periods that followed. According to the books of Samuel and Kings, only the establishment of the united monarchy changed the course of Israel's history and restored the unity that had been lost to the people since the days of Joshua. The tribes of Israel quickly became the kingdom of Israel. In fact, the Hebrew Bible described this period as the unprecedented high point in Israel's history. Although the kingdom was established by King Saul, a centralized military and massive political accomplishment were achieved in the days of David. Under David, huge areas were conquered, including territories of kingdoms bordering Israel, and the entire land between Egypt and central Syria became part of the expanded kingdom founded by the son of Jesse. These achievements allowed Solomon, David's son, to continue developing the kingdom of Israel and establish it on stable ground. According to the biblical description, Solomon built Jerusalem as a glorious capital with the palace and the temple at its center. He established a sophisticated administrative system comprised of 12 districts, fortified royal centers throughout the country, established a strong army, developed economic and political relations with distant kingdoms, and through all this brought unparalleled wealth to his kingdom. However, according to the first book of Kings, chapter 12, after the death of Solomon, his son and successor, Rehoboam, was unable to gain the loyalty of the 10 northern tribes, who withdrew from the united monarchy and established a separate kingdom. Thus, the rich and powerful kingdom was divided into two separate kingdoms, the kingdom of Israel in the north and the kingdom of Judah in the south. This is the opening of a new period in the nation's history, the period of the divided monarchy. The dynasty founded by David would remain in power in Judah, in Jerusalem, for over 300 years, while the northern kingdom would be ruled by a series of dynasties, many of whose leaders would come to power following military coups. In terms of the biblical description, there is no doubt that the kingdom of Judah is the central and important one, with Jerusalem as the unshakable center of this nation. Israel is described as the less important element amongst these two kingdoms, even though it was much bigger, rich, powerful, recognized among the kingdoms of the ancient Near East, had ruled over Judah for a long period, and on one specific occasion, it conquered Jerusalem and destroyed part of the wall surrounding it. While in another occasion, the weak Judah was spared conquest and takeover by the powerful kingdom of Israel. Ultimately, the kingdom of Israel was destroyed in 722 BCE, immediately after the Assyrian takeover of the southern Levant, leaving the kingdom of Judah to exist for another 140 years until the destruction of Judah by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, in 586 BCE. There are many severe problems with the biblical description of Israel's history up to the period of the divided monarchy. There is no other example in the ancient world of a situation where the identities and characteristics of a nation were formed before it had territory. According to biblical description, the laws, cult, identity, and all other national characteristics of Israel existed as early as the days of the desert generation, and they continue to exist unchanged in the following periods. In contrast, other nations developed social, religious, cultic, and governmental structures over long periods and always within a defined territory. Furthermore, there are also serious problems with the description of the glorious, splendid days of David and Solomon. How did the institution of the monarchy grow and become established as early as the days of Solomon, 2 generations after the founding of the kingdom, and become what is known to scholars as mature state, while in other nations such formative growth processes take several decades? And how did all the foundations, which were supposedly laid during the time of the United Monarchy, fade away immediately after the division of the kingdom, leaving the two new kingdoms in need of new institutional foundations? Instead of gradual development and growth that reached a peak at a late date, the Hebrew Bible presents an opposite picture of an early peak and a prolonged reading instead in the following years. Moreover, all the other kingdoms in the region are mentioned in other historical sources and have archaeological evidence to support their existence as a real kingdom. Whereas the kingdom of David and Solomon exists only in the biblical descriptions and has no evidence in other sources or in any archaeological find. The first and earliest mention of the house of David is in the Tel Dan inscription from the end of the 9th century BC, about a century after the days of the historical David, and it refers to a small kingdom of Judah in the south of the hill country next to the house of Omri, the king of Israel, to the north of it. There are many other problems within the biblical descriptions, such as the problem with the unity of the people of Israel that unites and separates into tribal elements according to the historiographical needs. From the unity during the days of the wandering in the desert that reached its peak under the leadership of Joshua and the conquest of the land, through the splitting into the tribal elements during the days of the judges, the reunification during the reign of Saul, David, and Solomon, and the division into the two kingdoms after Solomon's death. Similarly, there is also a problem with the description of the local population that was in Canaan, which appears and disappears according to the historiographical interests and needs. In the book of Joshua, which emphasizes the concept of the Deuteronomic law of the ban, extermination of the local population is described, concluding with a description of the land that yet remained in Joshua 13. In the book of Judges, various local and invading nations appear, all of whom control parts of the land because of the sins of the tribes of Israel, who adopted and followed the worship of the people who lived among them and around them. The foreign population disappears again from the description of the days of the United Monarchy, and afterwards there would also be no foreign population within the boundaries of the kingdom of Judah, even though, for example, David bought the threshing floor, the place of the future temple, from Jebusite Araunah. Solomon's mother, Bathsheba, was married to Uriah the Hittite. Kerethites and Pelethites took part in David's royal guard, and many other testimonies of foreigners and Gentiles existed within the realms of the kingdom. This framing of Israel in the Hebrew Bible is intended to illustrate the problems presented in reconstructing the history of the people of Israel based solely on the biblical framing. The attempt to compare this framing with archaeological reality and the data that emerge from the ancient written sources can only testify to the problematic trends of scholars who seek to establish the reliability of the biblical description, to prove it, and use archaeology to demonstrate its correctness. Indeed, there is a very big difference between the description of Israel in the Hebrew Bible and the historical Israel according to archaeological evidence, and I will ask to move now to check the history of Israel according to archaeological evidence. If we reconstruct a historical picture solely according to archaeological findings, completely ignoring the biblical descriptions, we can get a fairly well-established depiction with some limitations and gaps, but very different from the biblical picture. Well, it is not always possible to explain the processes that the archaeology, no, מתחיל עוד פעם. בסדר? If we reconstruct. If we reconstruct a historical picture solely according to the archaeological findings, completely ignoring the biblical descriptions, we can get a fairly well-established depiction with some limitations and gaps and very different from the biblical description. While it is not always possible to explain the processes that the archaeology testified to, archaeological finds provide the most stable starting point for the historical reconstructions of the history of Israel and the history of Judah. Let's start. In the second half of the second millennium BCE, the period that we call the Late Bronze Age, the Egyptian imperial centers were located on the coastal plain, while the main Canaanite cities were in the lowlands, like Lachish, Gat, and Gezer, and in the northern valleys like Megiddo and Chatzor. The local population concentrated in the cities and their surrounding regions. In the vast, relatively unpopulated areas, nomadic tribes called the Shasu roamed, as did groups of outlaws and those who escaped from the urban system and lived on the outskirts, called Apiru or Chabiru. These relatively empty areas were found mostly in the hill country, where there were three main urban systems. The Hebron entity in the south controlled large areas, and among them a relatively small population of tribal groups that would later coalesce into the tribal system of Judah. Jerusalem, in the center of the hill country, controlled limited areas around it, mainly and most likely the flat plateau between Mitzpah, Gibeon, and the watersheds to the east, and the relatively fertile valleys to the west and to the south of the city, including mainly the Sorek and the Rephaim valleys. In the northern hill country, Shechem controlled large areas, enjoying fertile valleys and more populated region, where the northern entities of the Kingdom of Israel would later develop. At the end of the 13th century BCE, in the twilight years of Egyptian hegemony over Canaan, the Egyptian kings of the 19th dynasty, as well as the first rulers of the 20th dynasty, consolidated Egyptian control over the land, bringing southern Canaan under direct Egyptian control. The major urban centers in the region were destroyed by the Egyptian army, or due to internal struggles between the Canaanite cities, or even maybe by the Shasu and Apiru groups. Only a handful of these centers were rebuilt during the 12th century BCE, resulting in larger parts of the former urban population becoming refugees who joined and strengthened the nomadic elements that operated in the space between the cities. The growth of these elements, alongside the decline in urban culture, resulted in a new and different settlement process that occurred mainly in the northern hill country surrounding the city of Shechem. Many tiny settlements emerged in the area in the 12th and 11th centuries BCE, causing a change in the population, which transitioned from the semi-nomadic culture that had characterized it until then to an agricultural culture of villagers and small settlements based on a combination of herding and agriculture. At the same time, further settlement process took place in the southern coastal plain and the western lowlands, mainly around the city of Ekron, where a large and fortified city was built, surrounded by satellite settlements. Ekron became the largest urban entity in the southern Levant until its destruction at the beginning of the 10th century BCE. These two centers, in the Samaria hill around Shechem and in the coastal plain and the lowland near Ekron, were comprised of the traditional local Canaanite population that survived the destruction of later Egyptian control. However, alongside this population lived many different groups, while the coastal plain also included an Aegean elite. The highlands contained mainly semi-nomads from marginal areas. And so, while the settlement in the hill country presented the local material culture that continued the Canaanite culture of the previous era, the settlement in the southern coastal plain was also characterized by new and foreign features originated in the Aegean Sea. It is not known when, how, and through what process the small settlements in the Samaria region and the central urban center of the city of Shechem were formed. Clearly, however, in the 10th century and the beginning of the 9th century BCE, this hilly region entity could have expanded its control towards the lowlands and the northern valleys. At the beginning of the 9th century BCE, the traditional center in Shechem was replaced by a large new urban center which was established few kilometers northwest of there in the city of Samaria. The compound built in Samaria included a podium constructed on large retaining walls and reshaped the natural hill, turning it into a man-made built box. A complex and elaborate palace were built at the top of the podium, the architecture of which involved the use of ashlar stones and decorated stone capitals. The same architectural style was revealed in the former Canaanite centers of the nearby areas, Megiddo and Jezreel in the Jezreel Valley, Chatzor to the north of the Sea of Galilee, and Gave to the east, and Gezer in the northern lowlands. Furthermore, the same architecture was uncovered in Transjordan, at two sites located in strategic places overlooking the main roads that passed through this area, namely in Khirbet al-Mudai Na'atemed and in Khirbet Ataruz, most likely the cities of Yahatz and Atarot, which are mentioned in the biblical narrative and also in the Meisha Stela that we will discuss later. It is possible to ignore the mention of the kings from the Omride dynasty in the Meisha Stele, the parallels in the Dan Stele, the mention of the king of Israel of the Omride dynasty in the Assyrian sources, and from the biblical stories in which the great kingdom of Israel of that time period is reflected. Notable in this context is the decisive superiority that the kingdom of Israel held over the kingdom of Judah in all parameters. Its population was 4 times larger than of Judah. We can assume that it was around 400,000 people. The urbanization in Israel was far more developed and including monumental architecture. Israel's administration and economy and trade were much more developed as well. In addition, Israel had much greater economic potential, as most of the fertile areas, main roads, and strategic junctions were within the territory of this kingdom. The northern kingdom also had a diverse and heterogeneous population, with groups from several diverse ethnic origin and different cultural traditions, including many descendants of the former Canaanite population. It's no wonder then that many religious concepts and cultural elements of Canaanite origin were imprinted into the cultural and traditions of this kingdom. Moreover, Israel shared borders with rich, strong, and culturally advanced kingdoms such as the Aram Damascus and Tyre, kept close contacts with these kingdoms during long periods, and gradually absorbed ritual and cultural elements from its neighbors. Thus, it is understandable why, as early as the 9th century BCE, several major cities had been established in the territory of the Kingdom of Israel. Chatzor, Megiddo, Rehov, Yokneam, Jezreel, Dor, and Gezer were strong fortification, economic, and administrative centers. Palaces and various other public buildings were built. In this period, the kingdom developed into what sociologists call a mature state, an established territorial political entity that includes hundreds of settlements of various sizes. It is not surprising that, as we will see below, Israel is prominently mentioned in this period in the royal inscriptions of the kings of Assyria. We're talking about Shalmaneser III and Adad Nirari III. In the inscription of the king of Aram, like Hazael, and the king of Moab, Mesha. At the time that the kingdom of Israel took shape and developed in the north, a similar, albeit smaller, entity began to take shape in the center of the hill country around the fortress built in Jerusalem. Its territorial border was the same as the one of the late Bronze Age kingdom of Jerusalem, consisting of no more than a dozen settlements that existed in the nearby hilly region. The kingdom of Judah included very poor areas with limited economic potential, especially in the hill country surrounding Jerusalem, areas that were also mostly peripheral and sparsely populated until the end of the 9th century BCE. However, unlike the kingdom of Israel, Judah was quite homogeneous demographically and consisted of local groups with pastoral roots. The kingdom was located in an area that is much more isolated, far from the main trade routes, from any common border with rich and powerful kingdoms. It shared a border only with the two Philistine kingdoms of Ekron and Gath in the west, as well as with the kingdom of Shechem, Israel, in the north. As such, until the 8th century BCE, Judah lagged for behind its northern neighbor in all aspects of organization and urban culture. In contrast to the power and size of the kingdom of Israel, only a few dozen small poor settlements were included in the territory of Judah in the 9th century BCE. The excavation in the city of David revealed the remains of a small settlement, strong but small, during this period, in the place that is supposed to be, and likely was, the capital of the kingdom of Judah. Archaeological excavation revealed several fortified cities from the 9th century BCE: Bet Shemesh, Lachish, Beersheba, Arad, Mitzpah, an indication for the existence of a central government and an administrative mechanism in the kingdom. Moreover, it seems that the economic and trade in Judah developed slowly and gradually in the second half of the 9th century BCE, both in the royal center of Jerusalem and in the secondary centers on the border of the kingdom. Hence, it shouldn't be surprising that the small kingdom of Judah, which was known as the House of David, was only mentioned in the Aramaic inscription in Tendan, in contrast to the many references to the kingdom of Israel in royal inscriptions from the same time. It was only in the 8th century BCE that the system of mature settlements developed in the kingdom of Judah indicating the emergence of the political, administrative, and economic hierarchy. During this period, large fortifications, public buildings, and luxury items appeared in Judah. This was also the time of the first mass production of pottery in Judah, produced in central workshops and distributed to all the borders of the kingdom, including the peripheral regions. The production of oil and wine also developed, progressing from the household level to a regional system and perhaps even to a national system. At the same period, when the kingdoms of Israel and Judah developed, in the hill country, in the lowlands, west of Jerusalem, the city of Gat, identified in Tel Etzafi, replaced Ekron as the main center. Gat quickly became one of the largest urban centers in the Levant and controlled large areas in the lowlands to the west of the border of Judah. However, in the middle of the 9th century BCE, a great wave of destruction hit all the major Israeli sites outside of the hill country, from Chatzor in the north to Gezer in the southwest and Khirbet Ataruz in the southeast. A parallel wave of destruction was also evident in the lowlands, where Gat and its satellite settlements were destroyed. A historical explanation for this wave of destruction can be found in the military campaign of Hazael, king of Aram Damascus, which is also related in 2nd Book of Kings, chapter 12, as well as in the parallel rebellion of Mesha, king of Moab, who is the focus of the story of Mesha's Stele, and also mentioned in the biblical description in the 2nd Book of Kings, chapter 1, and also chapter 3. As a historical hypothesis, it is possible to assume that the decline of the kingdom of Israel and the destruction of Gat underlie the expansion of Judah towards the lowlands, manifested in the construction of fortifications in Lachish and Bet Shemesh and the establishment of the settlement in Azekah, as well as to the Negev region, manifested in the construction of the royal center in Tel Beersheva that controlled the Arab trade route that passed through the Beersheva-Arad Valley. The monumental architecture at these sites shows that they were an enterprise of the rulers of Judah from their center in Jerusalem, which controlled in this time period the agricultural areas of the lowlands and the trade routes of the Beersheva-Arad Valley. The discovery of Bule in the city of David, along with luxury items, fish bones, and other objects, are clear signs of the administrative status of the elite and the existence of a local hill country capital of the small territorial kingdom. The kingdom of Israel survived the wave of destructions that occurred in the second half of the 9th century BCE, but at the beginning of the 8th century BCE, it rebuilt its important centers outside the hill country region, Gezer, Megiddo, and Chatzor, alongside new centers such as Dan in the north. The rulers of Samaria even reached as far south as the edge of the Sinai desert, as evidenced by the site of Kuntilat Ajrud, which created an alternative trade route from the Red Sea and the southern Transjordan area towards the coastal plain, parallel to the system that passed through the southern border of the kingdom of Judah in the Beersheva-Arad Valley. The kingdom of Israel in the first half of the 8th century BCE flourished mainly under the reign of Jeroboam II, and was characterized by a rich material culture and a strong, wealthy royal house with a wide range of economic ties and trade networks. To the south of the kingdom of Israel, the kingdom of Judah also enjoyed prosperity, although on a smaller scale than its northern neighbor. Although another change occurred during the 730s, when the mighty Assyrian Empire took control of all the Levant and destroyed all the large territorial kingdoms, including the kingdom of Aram Damascus and the kingdom of Israel. This destruction began in 732 BCE with all the Galilee, the coastal areas, and the Gilead. It concluded 10 years later with the final destruction of the city of Samaria. The rich and powerful kingdom that had existed for 200 years was destroyed. Its territory was annexed to Assyria, and 3 provinces were established on its territory continued to exist as such for hundreds of years. The province of Megiddo in the Jezreel Valley and the Galilee, the province of Dor along the northern Mediterranean coast, and the province of Samaria in the northern hill country. The major urban centers of the Kingdom of Israel were replaced by Assyrian imperial centers, populated by deportees brought in from far areas in the other sides of the empire. The Kingdom of Judah continued to exist when King Ahaz wisely chose to submit to Assyria as early as 732 BCE so that Judah could be integrated into the Assyrian imperial world. However, following Hezekiah's rebellion against Sennacherib, king of Assyria, in 704 BCE, the Assyrians embarked on their first major campaign against the kingdom of Judah and caused a massive wave of devastation in the lowlands, in the south of the Judean hills, and in the Beersheba Arad valleys. Large, rich areas in the lowlands were cut off from Judah and handed over to the neighbors, mainly to the kingdom of Ekron, which returned to be a significant power, especially for the olive oil industry and from an economic perspective in the lowlands. After 200 years in which Ekron existed as a small marginal kingdom on the outskirts of Judah, it grew and reconsolidated again, becoming a large and powerful city and the largest center for olive oil production, maybe in the whole Middle East. The archaeological research indicates that in the first half of the 7th century BCE, Judah was able to recover and prosper as a vassal kingdom of Assyria, and during the long years of King Manasseh, it became an important component of the Assyrian imperial system. After the withdrawal of Assyria during the reign of King Josiah, Judah underwent a short period in which it was able to consolidate and even expand its borders slightly. But soon, the Babylonian Empire took over the entire area and Judah became a vassal kingdom of Babylon. The rebellions of the day in the days of Jehoiakim and Zedekiah led to a second wave of destruction in Judah, which swept through Judah at the start of the 6th century BCE, and which this time included the razing of Jerusalem itself. All the important centers in Judah were destroyed, including the capital. However, the entire area around Jerusalem, Ramat Rachel and the Rephaim Valley to the south, and the Benjamin region to the north, remain unsketched. In these areas, a Babylonian province was established, one which continued to exist in the same form and with the same borders during the Persian period. That concludes the present construction according to the archaeological findings. Now, I will attempt to ignore the biblical description again and reconstruct the history of that Israelite entity solely according to the ancient inscriptions from the end of the 2nd millennium and 1st millennium BC. So let's think about the history of Israel according to epigraphic evidence. The earliest mention on an ethnic entity named Israel is found in the victory stele of Pharaoh Merneptah, who ruled between 1213 and 1203 BCE, where he enumerates a list of various enemies he defeated in the land of Canaan, including the identified cities of Gezer, Yenuam, and Ashkelon. In the same geographic area as Yenuam, perhaps in the area of Bet Shean, east of the Jordan, maybe close to Bet Shean from the Trans-Jordan side, the inscription mentioned a tribal group called Israel. According to the text in Merneptah stele, also known as the Israel stele, Israel has been wiped out. Its seed is no more. The importance of this statement, even if it exaggerates the victory of the Egyptians, is that at the end of the 13th century BCE, the Egyptians recognize the existence of a tribe or tribal entity, perhaps a local Shasu group that is mentioned in other inscriptions referring to the area around Bet Shean, Tel Rehov, and the Transjordan area close by. From then on, There is no known reference to Israel or Judah until the 9th century BCE. The inscription of Pharaoh Shishak the first in the temple of Amun-Re in Karnak, dated to the second half of the 10th century BCE, mentions many settlement sites, some of which can be identified in the territory of the Kingdom of Israel, but the names of the kingdoms of Israel and Judah are not mentioned. And this journey should be compared to the short description of Shishak I's campaign, which, according to the short description in the first book of Kings, chapter 14, took place during the reign of Rehoboam and Jeroboam. This topic will be discussed in one of the next chapters. The first inscription that mentioned the kingdom of Israel and the kings of Israel by name is the stele of Mesha, king of Moab. According to this stele, Omri was the king of Israel and oppressed Moab during many days. Very similar to the Merneptah stele, also in Mesha stele, it is described that along with the victory of the Moabite king and the fall of the Omride dynasty, I'm quoting, Israel was destroyed forever. Shalmaneser III, king of Assyria between 8559 and 824 BCE, also mentioned Israel in his inscription, what we call the Kurk monolith, according to Ahabu Siri Allah, which is Ahab the Israelites, contributed about 2,000 chariots and 10,000 soldiers to the coalition that fought against Assyria in the Battle of Karkar in northern Syria in 853 BCE. The same Assyrian king also mentioned Yehu, son of Omri, in one of his inscriptions, and also in the black obelisk from the time of Shalmaneser III, a portrait of Yehu, the son of Omri, is seen kneeling before the Assyrian king. It seems that although Yehu was from a competing dynasty that led to the elimination of the Omrides, from the point of view of the Assyrians, the name of the kingdom remained the name of the founder of the dynasty they recognized. This is probably the reason that the name the House of Omri, referring to the kingdom of Israel, also appeared in the inscriptions of Adad Nirari III of Kalach and Tiglath-Pileser III, which summarize the annexation of the territory of Aram Damascus. However, the Aramaic inscription found in Tel Dan, which apparently was written by Hazael, king of Aram Damascus, describes the conquest of the king of Israel, as well as the killing of both the king of Israel, apparently Joram, and the king of the house of David, likely Ahaziah. In 733 BCE, large areas of the king of Israel were conquered by Tiglath-Pileser III, and the capture of the Omride kingdom was mentioned by the Assyrian king in some of his summary inscriptions. Assyrian inscriptions describe how the capital, Samaria, was captured by Shalmaneser V in 722, and finally in 720, Sargon II describes in one of his inscriptions that he conquered Samaria along with all the land of the house of Omri. What does all this mean for the historical reconstruction of Israel? How would we reconstruct the history of Israel solely on the basis of these inscriptions, or solely on the basis of the inscriptions and archaeological findings, without the need to rely on biblical descriptions for our interpretations? So let's summarize this chapter of the podcast and talk about Israel and the Israelite from the historical perspective. The starting point for any historical reconstruction of ancient Israel is that apart from the biblical text, there is not a single historical source indicating that the broad Israeli nation, the sons of Israel, which also include the residents of the kingdom of Judah, ever existed. Even the direct interpretation of the archaeological finds without restoring to their use to confirm the biblical description does not support a reconstruction of the history of Israel in accordance with the biblical description as it is. There is no hint of the existence of the great united monarchy of the 10th century BCE, which ruled from Jerusalem over the whole country. Based on archaeological and epigraphic findings, it is clear that the kingdom of Israel and Judah developed separately and in parallel, with Israel developing earlier than Judah rather than being the result of one kingdom that split into two neighboring kingdoms. For our reconstruction, it seems correct to assume that the history of Israel began with the establishment of the historical kingdom of Israel, the northern kingdom, at the end of the 10th century, Shem, and then Samaria. This kingdom existed for about 200 years, and for most of that time, its capital was in Samaria. Although the name Israel was associated for 2 centuries only with the northern kingdom, while the southern kingdom of Judah was called the House of David or Judah. Some researchers assume that the concept of unity was preserved throughout the period in which the two kingdoms existed as part of the ancient history of both, while they comprised part of the same united monarchy. It is difficult to accept this assumption in light of the hostility that existed between the two kingdoms for long periods in their shared history. Notably, even in the last decades of the existence of the kingdom of Israel during the 8th century BCE, Israel and Judah fought each other during the reigns of Joash, king of Israel, and Amaziah, king of Judah, and of Pekah, king of Israel, and Ahaz, king of Judah, respectively. There is no evidence indicating that the relations between the two kingdoms were even friendly at any stage in the last years of the kingdom of Israel. In the last 30 years, questions appeared in the research regarding the initial unity of Israel and the historical existence of the united monarchy called Israel. Knowing the context of the historical existence of the northern kingdom, which was also called the King of Israel, researchers assume that the decision to use the term Israel for all the sons of Jacob, the sons of Israel, as a general and inclusive ethnic designation for the inhabitants of the kingdoms of Israel and Judah could only have been made after the destruction of the historical kingdom of Israel. The assumption was that after the physical destruction of the historical kingdom of Israel, when the term Israel was free from any topical use, the existence of a common God, Yahweh, in both kingdoms helped to create the unified identity. There are different and diverse opinions on the question of the origin of this common God, but its origin in the kingdom of Israel and its later acceptance as a supreme God in Jerusalem and Judah as part of the cultural and religious influence of the great and powerful northern kingdom on its neighbor to the south cannot be ruled. This was the context in which Judean writers cleared the name Israel of all the defined geographical and national political connotation it had, and imprinted on it a new cultural and religious meaning. In the historiographic field, the new idea of the early history of Israel prevailed and was used as the name for the broader ethno-religious entity around which the early history of the nation took place. According to many researchers, this was a political and literary decision made in Judah at the end of the 7th century BCE, about a century after the historical kingdom of Israel was destroyed, perhaps as a part of the desire to consolidate Judean rule over the entire territory of the two kingdoms, to include the inhabitants of the two kingdoms under the rule of the Davidic dynasty, maybe the time of Josiah, and to inherit the place of historical Israel with Jerusalem as the center of the entire united monarchy in its new guise. Israel became the name of the united entity of the people of Israel, both Israel and Judah, the people chosen by God. During this period, another layer was added to the memories and descriptions of the founding kings of the kingdom of Judah. This period was described as the heyday of the United Monarchy, one in which the Davidic kings ruled from Jerusalem over the entire land from Dan to Beersheba. The history of this period became a model for the future, and the term Israel was taken out of its historical context and chosen as a title that unified the two kingdoms as the name of the nation as a whole. Thus, the idea of ancient Israel was created as that large and unified general entity which was birthed from a single family from which the tribes of Israel grew, and on the basis of which the kingdom of Israel of the days of David and Solomon existed. The need also arose to merge between different stories and sources and unite them into a single story about a single people with a single history. This description also incorporated ancient texts, some of which were very ancient. For example, some of the stories that were collected and pertain to Jacob, Israel, the forefather of the historical kingdom of Israel, the northern kingdom centered in Samaria, were created and developed and perhaps even written in ancient periods in the history of the development and formation of the kingdom of Israel. At that point, these stories were of great importance compared to the issues that preoccupied the kings of Israel in ancient times in the process of the formation of the historical kingdom of Israel. Some examples include the shaping of the relationship between Israel and the Arameans, the neighbors that they had to the north, the site of Gilead between the Arameans and the kingdom of Israel, and the position of the central temples of the kingdom, such as Bethel and Penuel. The stories about Jacob were merged and combined with the ancient text about Abraham, which also existed from the ancient times and mainly related to the sanctuary in Mamre, near Hebron, the ancient center of the tribe of Judah. The linking and connecting of all these texts was a long process that began only during the exilic and post-exilic periods, during which a comprehensive and inclusive and clearly ahistorical story was created about the history of the nation's forefathers. In these stories, Abraham was presented as the ancestral father of Judah, and the connection to Jacob, Israel, was created through Isaac, who became Jacob's father. Thus, the sons of Jacob, Israel, were connected to Abraham and Isaac, and the Judahites' interest in presenting things in this way made Abraham, the Hebronite, a forefather of the whole nation. In the next chapter, we'll first discuss how the description of the conquest of the land by the Israelites under the leadership of Joshua was shaped. Then, we'll emphasize the role of ideology in the development of the historical descriptions. We will expose and explore how problematic it is to rely on these stories about the ancient past of the nation in reconstructing a reliable historical reality. See you in the next chapter.